Okay, well, I guess my first question was, how did you come up with the idea for the story?
Right. I got sort of the seed of the idea from a really brief newspaper article that I read many years ago. And it wasn't a full-fledged article, it was just a little mention of two young girls who had been kidnapped together, I think in California actually, and so they weren't from different states, they were just from different parts of Los Angeles, if I remember right. And they were held captive by a man for a few days, after which they escaped, but I think that he had done horrible things to them in that time, but they had not known each other before, and then they sort of collaborated in order to escape. And that was the part of the story that interested me. And so I found myself thinking, would they have stayed friends afterwards? Would their parents have let them? Would they have tried to see each other? Or would they have written letters? Or would their parents have said, like, no, it's best to just cut ties and not remind yourself of what happened? And so that was really where the germ of the idea came from. And obviously I changed almost everything about it. But it was really the idea of the relationship that got me.
When Lois was talking to Sean over at the bar, she ended up telling him, like, this really elaborate story with all these, like, horrible things that happened to them, supposedly. Is that what happened to the real girls that this happened to, or was that just something you came up with?
Nope, just made that up. Yeah, that was a strange, that still seems like a strange part of the novel to me, and it required a different kind of imagination in a way, because power had to do with storytelling in a way. So, you know, a knife is nice, but a story can be just as powerful.
Yeah. Speaking of stories, I noticed that, I think it was part 3, but you put a book inside of a book.
Yep.
So I was wondering, like, why you did that.
That was part of my idea from the start, because the whole sort of narrative mechanism for getting Lois and Chloe back together, of course, is that Lois has written this book and Chloe gets cast in the movie version of it. Porphyria.
Porphyria's Love. Was that kind of like a foreshadow for what he would have done to them had he thought about doing that? Or was that just a story that you had just incorporated?
Well, it's a wonderful poem by Robert Browning, and it's a really strange and disturbing little poem. But I liked the idea that, first of all, it was something that they could plausibly have read. He might have had that book in the cabin. But I also did think that it sort of becomes something that they can look back on later and understand it as a kind of model for what could have happened to them, because in the poem, the speaker wants to preserve his love. He wants to keep her with him, and she has sort of escaped from the big house to come be with him in his little cottage, and then she's going to go back, and she's going to marry somebody else, probably, and the only way that he can think of to keep her
Was her...
to strangle her with her own hair, and she wraps around her neck, and then he sits with her all night, and she's still beautiful and entirely passive because she's dead. She can't leave him. So he possesses her, but ironically he has also destroyed the thing that he wanted to possess. But in the poem he's mad, so he doesn't really understand the contradiction. And so when I had Lois and Chloe sort of think back on that at the end of the novel, I think they see that that was sort of the only way it could ever play out. That if he wanted to keep them, ultimately he would have had to do something like that.
Right. One thing that I noticed was that Lois, she would always bring up words. Like, she would think of a word and it started with one letter, and then she would bring up other words that started with that letter. And it was just like, why did you incorporate them into the book in that way?
That was one of the very early aspects of Lois that came clear to me when I was sort of dreaming up the characters. And it's also one of the few things in the novel that is a little bit connected to my own life, because like Lois, I was one of those spelling bee kids when I was younger, so my head was full of words. But for the purposes of Lois's word lists, I actually didn't rely on my own ability to conjure up strange words in my head anymore. So I used some lists that I found online of just unusual words. And then I chose them really carefully so that they sort of both just kind of sounded good together, but also what I wanted as the novel progresses was for the word lists to become more and more relevant. Later, I wanted the words to at least sort of subconsciously register sort of overarching themes, or to be at least in some loose way connected to things that she's thinking about or things that she's experiencing. And then by the end, the words have become sort of central to what she's thinking about.
Yeah. It was like the word syzygy. Okay.
Syzygy.
Yeah, and it was, and then Zed ended up explaining it with his himself as the sun, and then Lois was the Earth, I do believe.
I think Lois
was the moon. Yeah, and then Chloe was the Earth, and it was just like I realized this later on in the book after she spelled out the definition and everything, but it's kind of like that's how their lives ended up being.